2 weeks ago, I posted the same forum post in 4 different Discord servers, and I responded to everyone who disagreed. So today, I'll be going through all the arguments that were given in favor of free will. Hi, my name is Michael, and this video is part of a broader series where I'll be trying to build my own belief system from the ground up. This series will start with the most foundational questions, like for example, how do I know what's real? Do we have free will? What is morality? Then we'll move up to questions about justice and wealth distribution, and finally to specific policies that help us achieve these goals. Today's topic is free will, and I'll stay on this foundational layer until I feel very confident about my positions. I could be wrong, and that's exactly why I want to stay there on this layer for as long as I can, because I think the upper layers of this pyramid will require a solid foundation. So let me start by reading what I posted in those 4 Discord servers. The title was "Free Will Most Likely Doesn't Exist." I wrote most likely rather than doesn't exist because I can't be certain. Because one of my claims against free will is that it's unfalsifiable. So it wouldn't really make sense for me to claim certainty that it doesn't exist. Here's the definition I use for free will. Quote, "An action is free in the sense required for moral responsibility only if the decision to perform it is not an alien deterministic event, nor a truly random event, nor a partially random event." Quote, alien deterministic is just a fancy word for an event that is determined by something outside of your control. Now, this definition comes from Derek Pereboom's book, Living Without Free Will, and I chose this definition because I think the crux of the free will debate is whether or not we have moral responsibility. That's why I specify actions that are free in the sense required for moral responsibility. If you define free will differently, for example, let's say the ability to react and change when encountering new information, well, that ability wouldn't be enough for moral responsibility. So I dismiss that definition as being irrelevant to this discussion. So what exactly is moral responsibility? Well, the kind of moral responsibility I'm talking about is where someone has what philosophers call basic desert for their actions. Desert means to deserve something. So basic desert means they deserve, for example, punishment, not because it deters future crimes, but just because they freely committed the action. Think of it this way. If you deserve punishment in the most basic sense, it means your actions tilted some sort of cosmic balance, and the punishment's goal is to restore equilibrium on that balance. For example, if someone robs a bank and has basic desert, you could justify putting them in solitary confinement, not because it's useful, research shows solitary confinement doesn't really work, but just because you want to make them suffer for their wrongs. I believe personally that free will doesn't exist, so people can't be held morally responsible for their actions. They lack the basic desert required for moral responsibility. So what exactly does it mean to not hold someone morally responsible? Well, our criminal justice system already has examples of this, one being the insanity defense. Quote, "Some acts of murder are committed out of insanity by individuals suffering from psychotic mental disorders. According to the law in many countries, these individuals do not have criminal responsibility. They are defined as not guilty due to insanity and therefore cannot be punished." Now, does this mean that we have to let them go free and just let them run around killing people left and right? Well, of course not. Quote, "Instead, they are involuntarily hospitalized in psychiatric wards." So even without moral responsibility, we can still justify removing someone's freedom to protect everyone else's safety. Now, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I'm essentially arguing we should extend how we treat people with severe mental illness to most, if not all, criminals, because there's no basic desert difference between the two groups. But I'll talk about this in a future video. Now, let me go through the arguments I encountered, starting with post number 1. The first response challenged my claim that free will is unfalsifiable.
Free will is certainly falsifiable in the general sense that things are falsifiable. Otherwise, courtrooms wouldn't ever consult free will contemporaries, and the literature wouldn't contain anything about manipulation.
Using courtrooms as evidence for free will is circular reasoning. These same courtrooms presuppose free will exists. In the 1978 case United States versus Grayson, they explicitly stated that a deterministic view of human behavior is, quote, inconsistent with the underlying precepts of our criminal justice system, unquote, and that our legal system rests on, quote, belief in freedom of the human will and a consequent ability and duty of the normal individual to choose between good and evil, unquote. The ability to make rational choices isn't really free in any meaningful sense. Human cognition, whether in someone with schizophrenia or someone neurotypical, operates entirely within the bounds of natural laws. It's just really hard to think of ordinary actions as not freely made because they're shaped by much less obvious and much more complex causes. To truly have free will, someone would need to have the ability to initiate brain activity without that brain activity being caused by anything else. If an action is only caused by prior events, for example, biological or environmental events, then it's not freely chosen. Now, you don't have to show that human behavior is completely independent of any prior causes. You would just need to show that some brain activity doesn't have any prior causes, and this brain activity meaningfully influences the behavior. Unfortunately, this cannot be done. Since human behavior is chaotic, it wouldn't be humanly possible to perfectly predict the brain. And that is why I say that free will is unfalsifiable. If you're interested, I recently made a video talking about just that. The link will be in the description down below. Now, to be fair, the claim that everything is determined is also unfalsifiable because I could say that events that seem random only seem that way because we don't perfectly understand the universe. So I prefer saying that determinism is approximately true because our universe seems to be governed by natural laws that can be predicted. Now, in response to that, he dropped the claim that free will is falsifiable and went with this.
First, the standard being used, falsifiability, is a bad criteria. The majority of philosophy is unfalsifiable. You can't falsify your own existence. The reliability of your memory, consciousness, logic, or even the standard of falsifiability, making it both unhelpful and self-defeating. If anything, one should take the approach of trying to simply give an account that best explains the data.
He's right that some unfalsifiable beliefs are unfalsifiable and yet accepted. But first, let me clarify what exactly I mean by unfalsifiable. A simple falsifiable claim would be this one: all swans are white. Unless your definition of swan includes the fact that swans are white, this claim is easily falsifiable because someone could find a swan of any other color and this would disprove the claim. On the other hand, the claim that souls exist is unfalsifiable because by definition, souls are not physical, so cannot be tested. Humans could know everything that is possible for us to know in the universe, and we still wouldn't be able to falsify it. So, an unfalsifiable claim is one that cannot reasonably be proven to be false by empirical tests or by argumentation. But not all unfalsifiable claims are created equal. There are some we clearly feel justified in rejecting. For example, if I claim that I have an invisible friend on another plane of reality that no one but me can see, you would clearly feel justified in rejecting this claim. Other unfalsifiable claims stop scientific progress, like claiming living things have some unmeasurable life force. So, how do we decide which unfalsifiable claims to accept and which to reject? Well, the standard I'm using is pragmatic coherence. What assumptions must we actually make to think, reason, communicate, or act at all? Because to even begin to seek the truth, you must presuppose certain things, or else truth seeking becomes impossible. For example, without believing in induction, which means drawing general conclusions from observations, we can't experiment or think about our universe at all. How can you be sure that when, I drop this bottle, gravity will pull it to the ground? Or how do I know that this bottle won't just start floating midair when I release it, right? The answer is that you can't be sure. This is called the problem of induction in philosophy. But again, even if you can't really justify this belief, you need to believe in it to function and seek truth. So, induction is one necessary unfalsifiable claim. What are the others? Well, to help us, there's this concept in philosophy called scientific realism. It's the idea that quote, well-confirmed scientific theories are approximately true, the entities they postulate do exist, and we have good reason to believe their main tenets. In the book Understanding Philosophy of Science, I came across a very compelling argument in favor of this view known as the no miracle argument, originally presented by Hilary Putnam, and it goes like this, quote, the positive argument for realism is that it is the only philosophy that doesn't make the success of science a miracle, unquote. In other words, it would be an incredible coincidence, essentially a miracle, if things like microwaves worked exactly as they should, if electromagnetic waves were real, or if electron microscopes behave just as expected if atoms actually existed. The best explanation for science's consistent success is that its core theories are at least approximately describing something real. So I think we're justified in assuming scientific progress is real. So what we can do is work backwards and figure out what unfalsifiable claims were necessary to achieve this progress. To that, add the unfalsifiable claims needed to function as humans, for example, the unfalsifiable claims that your memories are at least somewhat real, and you have a list of all the unfalsifiable claims we need to believe in to function. All others should be dismissed, or at least you should only believe in those that are plausible given our current scientific understanding. It would take me a lot of time to figure out which unfalsifiable claims would be in this necessary list. But one thing I'm sure I feel confident about is that free will doesn't belong on that list. So it should be weighed against our current scientific evidence. I'll explain later in this video why I think the concept of free will isn't needed in the first place.
No, I think it's much easier to disprove libertarianism. Libertarianism is that there is free will, and it's incompatible with determinism. Free will, as you stated, is the control condition for responsibility. So if no one is ever responsible, then libertarianism is false. Some people are sometimes responsible, and we agree incompatibilism is true. Therefore, libertarianism unavoidably follows.
I distinguish between responsibility and moral responsibility. You can have responsibility without free will, and holding someone responsible just means influencing the person through consequences, not about desert or blame.
Every time we deliberate, we presuppose we have something meaningful to add to the given circumstances. Every time we criticize someone for bad argumentation, we presuppose he is rationally responsible. Every time we make a knowledge claim, we presuppose a belief has been justified by a brutally teleological cause. If you let some unfalsifiable claims pass to unavoidability, free will without a doubt should likewise get no less of a free pass.
That's because we actually do have something meaningful to add. An AI, for example, is fully determined, yet it still deliberates. The fact that its behavior is determined doesn't make that deliberation any less necessary or functional. A meaningful contribution doesn't require free will, just effective information processing. To this, he responded,
This is incompatible with determinism, which stipulates all effects are necessitated by antecedent causes. The ability to add to the causal chain is no different than rejecting determinism. Also, in what way does AI deliberate? If anything, it has conditioned reflexes which are neither conscious nor meaningful to the AI system. It may be meaningful to others in the sense that a rock is meaningful to a child, or lab results are meaningful to a researcher. But these are uncontroversially insufficient for rationality, communication, thought, etc.
Okay, let me make this simpler. Imagine a causal chain. A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F plus G equals H. Now let's say that E in this chain is your deliberation. By that, I just mean careful thinking or discussion, which can totally be described in deterministic terms. Now, imagine a parallel universe where that deliberation doesn't happen. E is missing from the causal chain. In that case, the chain wouldn't lead to H. You'd get a different outcome. So the act of deliberating actually does matter. It changes the result. It adds something meaningful to the process, not in some, magical sense, but in a causal, functional way. And this type of deliberation is not the same as adding a new piece to the causal chain. Now, maybe when he says meaningful, he means something different, like, adding emotional or symbolic meaning. If that's what he's getting at, I'm not really sure why deliberation would need to do that in the first place. Why should thinking things through have to add that kind of meaning?
Belief in basic desert is a prerequisite for rationality, that one ought not affirm contradictory beliefs, that one ought to strive for true beliefs, that one ought to be epistemically humble at times, etc., are things that are constitutive of rationality.
I'm not sure we're using the same definition of rationality here. In a deterministic universe, rationality can just mean how well your thinking lines up with reality, how closely your beliefs match the evidence, and how effectively your actions serve your goals. If evolution is approximately true, then we probably evolved to be rational because having accurate beliefs helped us survive. But of course, we're not always rational. There's even a whole book called Predictively Irrational that explores how people behave irrationally, but often for surprisingly good reasons. To me, rationality seems more like a standard we've set for ourselves because, in general, it leads to better outcomes. And as we'll see later in this video, morality doesn't disappear just because people aren't ultimately morally responsible. Now, when I said that we can assign consequences to shape future behavior rather than to blame people, he responded with,
Such process presupposes one can act in a difference-making way. Determinism undercuts this belief as it removes both sourcehood and causal opportunities.
this idea that humans can't change their behavior because they're determined is a common misconception, and it's one that's going to come up a lot in this video. So let's take a simple example. Imagine a guy named John who steals his coworker's lunch. He gets caught and gets called by HR. HR says, hey, stealing someone else's lunch isn't acceptable here, so what needs to happen so you don't do this again? They then have a conversation, and after that, John stops stealing lunches. Now, where exactly in this scenario does free will become necessary? Because there's a behavior the community sees as a problem, John stealing lunches. There's a consequence, John being called into HR, and that consequence is meant to shape future behavior. Now, whether or not John changes is determined, but if he does change, then the consequences served its purpose. That's all you need. Now, what about sourcehood? The idea that John has to be the ultimate origin of the action to be held responsible. Someone might say, well, John is not the true source of the theft. The real cause goes back infinitely far into the past. And, fair enough, I can't really argue with that. But here's the thing. Being the ultimate source of an action isn't necessary to hold someone responsible in a practical, non-moral way. All that's required is the capacity to respond to feedback and adjust behavior. Think of it like this. If a water pipe bursts and floods a house, are we going to hold the pipe responsible? No. Pipes don't process information or learn from their mistakes. Instead, we look at the causal chain. Who did something that could reasonably be expected to be done differently next time? Maybe the homeowner bought the wrong pipe, or maybe the installer did a poor job. In that case, holding the installer accountable makes sense, not because they're the ultimate source of the problem, but because they're capable of changing their behavior in response to new information. And if they can't do that, if the installer is incapable of improving, then maybe that job just isn't for them. We usually expect people in certain roles to be able to adjust based on outcomes. Honestly, I think that this is a more logical approach than obsessing over whether someone is the true source of their actions. Maybe the installer messed up because their employer overbooked them and rushed the job. In that case, maybe the employer shares some responsibility too. And that's the point. Responsibility can be distributed along the causal chain based on who can respond and make changes. It doesn't have to be metaphysical, it just has to work.
I disagree that an action is free in the sense required for moral responsibility only if the decision to perform it is not an alien deterministic event, nor a truly random event, nor a partially random event. I think the decision to perform an action can be deterministic, and yet moral responsibility can exist. Determinism can underlie your contemplation of processing information, moral considerations, and it's because you have situational awareness and preferences does it make your action free.
The main problem I have with this argument is that it only makes sense intuitively if you describe the actions as being done by an agent. Here are two cases to illustrate my point. Number one, James is an ordinary man with average self-control. Every Wednesday, he walks past a truck full of luxury watches. It's always the same. One person unloads it and the truck is left unattended each time they step inside the store. Every week, James thinks of how easy it would be to steal a box. One day, he does. Now, the second case was generated by ChatGPT because I don't know yet enough about the brain to do it. Each week, a typical adult brain encounters a repeated situation, an unguarded truck filled with valuable items. The reward system, especially the ventral stratum and dopaminergic pathways, registers this as a tempting opportunity. Simultaneously, the prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control and moral reasoning, suppresses the urge to act. With repetition, the brain's valuation system in the orbital frontal cortex begins assigning higher reward value and lower perceived risk, possibly due to habituation in the amygdala's threat response circuits. This shifts the balance. Inhibitory control weakens and the reward signal grows stronger. Eventually, a moment of reduced prefrontal regulation due to fatigue, stress, or random fluctuation allows the motor cortex to act on the impulse. Although both situations are the same, the second case doesn't have the same intuitive force, yet it would be a more accurate description of what's going on. This, I think, weakens the case for moral responsibility. It seems like the more you understand the underlying causes and mechanism behind someone's action, the less intuitive moral responsibility becomes.
If you can't imagine free will, you don't really possess it. Those are the holdouts. It's also said that humans achieve sentience, just like artificial intelligence does in sci-fi movies. This may happen generally during teenagehood, but it doesn't always. That is honestly my experience. The ones who really enjoy arguing free will just lack the imagination to see it. You can ask them questions like, what would free will look like if you could create the cosmos? And they lack the imagination to answer.
When someone disagrees with you and your response is, well, that's just because you don't have what I have, that's not an argument. It's evasive and thought-terminating. I mean, I could just as easily say that I have something called infinite will. It's way better than free will, so advanced in fact that I can't even explain it to you because it's just that superior. And people like you who deny that I have infinite will, well, you clearly don't have it. Simple as that. Now, to be fair, there are traits people might have that I personally can't experience. Some of those can be tested, others not so much. For example, if someone says they can see UV light, well, we could probably design an experiment to check that, but others can't be tested. For example, I have something called hyperphantasia. It's the ability to create extremely vivid mental images. And let's say for the sake of argument, there's no way to test that objectively. So you will just have to believe me. And to that you might say, fine, I'll believe you. However, that still isn't the same as someone claiming to have free will, because I'm not saying hyperphantasia makes me better than anyone else. I'm not using it to claim moral superiority or to argue that I deserve special treatment. But if I did say, hey, I have hyperphantasia, so I'm superior and should be prioritized over people who don't, and you should give me all your money, then yeah, it would be totally reasonable for people to be skeptical or even to reject that idea entirely. The point is, just claiming that the reason I don't believe in something is because I don't have it doesn't make it valid, especially when that trait is being used to elevate yourself above others.
The phrase alien deterministic event is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Sourcehood theorists would say that freedom is about willing in accord with one's own will, irregardless if that will is utterly determined or not. And this is not alien.
Just being the source of an action isn't enough to make someone morally responsible. Take someone with schizophrenia, for example. They might technically be the source of a violent act, but we usually don't hold them morally responsible for it because they lack control and connection with reality. So simply being the source of an action without the right kind of control doesn't really carry moral weight.
It is not clear that an event is either random or physically determined. A leeway theorist would say that willing in a manner that is sufficiently free of physical constraints is freedom, and this is not random or alien.
Leeway theorists argue that as long as someone's will is free enough from constraints, even in a determined universe, that's enough for moral responsibility. But I don't really see how that works. If there aren't any real alternative possibilities or actual control, then where's the moral responsibility exactly? It's like saying an equation 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 0 + 1 + 1 = 6 has wiggle room just because you get to decide where to put the 0.
I am a compatibilistic libertarian, which holds that leeway, freedom exists transcendentally, but is not outside the purview of non-physical, deterministic constraints. A good analogy is computer software. The application has some leeway in what the rules are for the application itself, but that leeway is constrained by the rules for the hardware. Similarly, reason is governed by her own laws and not directly by the laws which govern the brain. Although the brain facilitates reason, it does not completely determine it according to the laws it must abide by. Moral responsibility exists exactly because one can reason in accord with her own laws, in accord with memories, emotions, beliefs, etc., and are not completely jerked around by how the brain itself operates. Under your view, there is no moral responsibility?
This person has a similar view of free will as Kant. According to Kant, quote, if a human being were led merely by natural laws, it would be impossible to impute to him any action, since the ground of action then would never lie in his control, but rather would be determined in the previous time. Therefore, he says that we humans have something he calls transcendental freedom, so that our actions can be ascribed to us and not to an infinite causal chain. Kant's idea seems to be that transcendental freedom is justified mainly because it contains no logical contradiction and because it's necessary to be moral agents. Quote, but though I cannot know, I can yet think freedom, that is to say, the representation of it is at least not self-contradictory. Quote, I would agree that there are no logical contradictions, so there seems to be two ways of interpreting transcendental freedom. The first interpretation is that humans have a kind of transcendental freedom that shapes their deeper non-physical decisions, but those decisions always just happen to match the choices we'd make in a fully determined physical world by coincidence. So even if we are free in some deeper sense, it never actually changes what we do in any way that we can observe. Another way is that humans make truly free choices on this deeper level, but those choices have absolutely no effect on what happens in the physical world. If that's true, then a universe with transcendental freedom would look exactly the same as one without it, as long as the physical laws stay the same. From what I understand, this person aligns more with the second interpretation. So this freedom he's talking about can't be tested, can't even be known, and doesn't affect what the brain actually does. And the main justification for believing in this freedom, at least according to Kant, is that it's logically possible and that it serves a moral purpose. Not only that, but I would fight on the idea that it is necessary for morality. So the only thing that would be left as evidence or justification for this belief is that there are no logical contradiction. Now, if we go back to the code analogy, let's say that in the code there's this line: if answer is bigger than 10, then fly. The computer is bound by the laws of its hardware and therefore cannot fly. The code has the leeway to have lines that is outside the bounds of the hardware, but how is that freedom if the line does nothing additional? Also, the fact that there are no logical contradictions is not very compelling. It's like if I claim that the moon and the earth are connected not just by gravity, but by the deep bond they've formed through countless years of orbiting together. Their paths can't be fully understood without recognizing the quiet friendship that holds them in motion. There's no logical contradiction in the statement that I just made, that the moon and the earth have a transcendental friendship that gives them leeway in how they interact, but this leeway doesn't go against their determined path. But if the physical world, like the brain, can be fully predicted on its own before any deeper transcendental reality even comes into play, then how is that real freedom? It's like playing a game where only the X button does anything, and the only thing it does is skip to the next dialogue, but you think you have freedom in the game because the controller has other buttons. Sure, you can press them if you want, but they don't actually change anything.
For me, we can know we have both practical and transcendental freedom, and that they are both conjoined with each other, because thinking in accord with the principles of reason, i.e., practical freedom as Kant puts it, in accord with one's will, e.g., their passions, desires, beliefs, etc., is to will new chains of causality derived therefrom, i.e., transcendental freedom.
Alright, this is where things start to get a bit tricky. So, practical freedom is the ability to make decisions based on reason rather than just impulse. Basically, his point is that when you choose what to do based on your own thoughtful reasons and values, you're truly free. And that's what makes real change possible. But to me, that sounds like just begging the question. It's just restating the assumption that we're free because it feels like we are free. It's like saying we're free because we act from reason. And how do we know acting from reason means freedom? Well, because acting from reason is what free people do. Sure, when we make decisions that align with our values, it feels different from just reacting impulsively. But that feeling isn't evidence that we're creating, new chains of causality out of thin air. Why should rational thinking require freedom in the metaphysical sense? You can have incredibly complex systems in a deterministic universe. So even if rationality feels deep and layered, that doesn't mean it's free. It just means it's complicated.
Our cognition, sensibility, judgment, etc. a priori most certainly influences and causes noticeable aspects of our consciousness, and the transcendental freedom would be the ability to reason in accord with these a priori laws, which reason has in a way that is in accord with the organized self that one has. In fact, the higher processes of the brain impact the lower processes and parts which facilitate those higher processes. It is a feedback loop. My observance of the phenomenal property of redness, albeit it not real in the sense of the redness being an aspect or member of reality itself, can influence my decision-making, and I can make that decision if my brain is perfectly healthy, in a manner that is not jerked around in the slightest by the natural laws that govern that brain.
Here, I don't really see the need to assume that the higher level processes of the brain require some kind of explanation outside the physical. Or maybe that's not what he's saying. Maybe he's trying to argue that this so-called transcendental freedom is an emergent property of the brain, something that arises from the brain but can't be fully reduced to its parts. And to this argument, here's a quote from the book Determined, where the author quotes psychologists Michael Mascolo and Eva Kallio, who say, quote, "While emergent systems are irreducible, they are not autonomous in the sense of having causal powers that override those of their constituents." In other words, emergent properties aren't magic. They still have to follow the laws of physics. Take his example of the color red. It's true that even if you understand exactly how the brain processes wavelengths of light, you still can't fully explain why experiencing red feels the way it does. You know, red and blue are different because they correspond to different wavelengths, but why a certain wavelength feels red and not blue, or why it isn't the other way around, that's something we just don't fully get yet. But again, just because this experience is an emergent property doesn't mean it breaks physical laws. Take water, for example. A single H2O molecule doesn't have a boiling point or surface tension, but when you put a bunch of them together, those properties emerge. Still, no matter how many water molecules you add, they'll never suddenly turn into iron atoms. Now, to my video game example, he said this.
It still has leeway in the sense that there may be a character in a game that can fly in the game, but none of the hardware which facilitates that ability, or even the person that made it, can fly. There are undeniably two different sets of laws here governing two different sets of things, but one is dependent on the other.
The only question I have is, how do you know this? If someone tells you they can fly, but unfortunately are subject to the laws of physics, well, the only sensible reply is, well, then you can't fly. No matter what abilities you may imagine yourself to have if the laws of nature were different, the fact is that you don't have them in this reality. Here was a response to me saying that his definition of free will was unfalsifiable.
To be fair, Kant's original formulation can be charged with this, but I don't see how mine does. We can examine the way people behave and how brains work and determine that it is quite plausible. Reason is facilitated by the brain in a manner where what is reasoned over is not directly jerked around by the brain. I think you are thinking about the brain and reason as having a relationship like a domino hitting another domino, or a windmill turning, when really it is more like a computer game that is run on computer hardware. I don't see the computer example as analogous to the windmill example.
I'm not sure what neuroscience he's referring to because from what I've seen, including the split brain experiments, reasoning clearly depends on the brain's structure and activity. In those studies, patients with their corpus callosum severed, it's the part of the brain that connects the two hemispheres, had two hemispheres that operated independently. One side could see or do something that the other couldn't access, leading to strange cases where a person's hand could draw something they couldn't describe verbally. This shows that reason functions like any other cognitive process. It operates within specific brain regions and depends on the information those regions receive. He seems to be treating reason as something separate from the physical processes that produce it. I'm not. And I think that's where we're really disagreeing. I don't see why reason needs to be independent of the brain. And so far, I haven't heard a strong reason to adopt that view, other than the claim that some form of transcendental freedom is necessary for moral agency, which I'll get to in a moment.
I don't think we should accept any unfalsifiable claims. Even good axioms aren't unfalsifiable. An unfalsifiable claim is one that cannot in principle be refuted.
Unless you can show me that we don't have to rely on induction, then yes, you do have to accept at least some unfalsifiable claims. And I think the reason he sees his belief as justified isn't because it's testable or even because it's particularly plausible. It's because he believes we can't be moral agents without his idea of transcendental freedom.
Rightness and wrongness are about beings capable of rational deliberation, behaving in accord with goodness of their own free choice. So it doesn't make sense to say that, e.g., Bob did the wrong thing and yet isn't responsible for his actions. The reason, e.g., lions are not moral agents is because, although they can behave in accord with goodness, they lack the sufficient freedom and rationality to be able to make choices.
This is something I want to think about more deeply in the future, how morality works in a world without free will, so I can build a stronger foundation. But here are my thoughts so far. If evolution is approximately true, and we live in a deterministic world that is also physical, then it makes sense that our morality evolved along with us. As our survival became more dependent on cooperation and social interaction, we developed rules, instincts, and emotional responses that we now recognize as morality. So, is there such a thing as objective right or objective wrong? Not really. But does that mean right and wrong doesn't exist? Also, not necessarily. Morality in this view is real in the same way money or language is real. It's a shared human construct, deeply ingrained in how we function as a species. The difference is morality is harder to change than currency because it's wired into us on a pretty deep level. So how do we define wrong? One way is to say that it's an action that triggers a strong negative emotional response in the community of humans you are living in. I say community of humans because while some moral instincts are shared across humanity, others are shaped by culture and environment. This negative feeling I'm talking about isn't just sadness or pain. It's something closer to disgust or moral revulsion, like the feeling you get watching a helpless child being beaten up by an adult. That visceral reaction is the kind of emotional response I think moral wrongness is built on. A good example of how morality is a human construct and shifts over time is animal cruelty. In many communities today, cruelty to animals is considered morally wrong, not because of some universal rule, but because more and more people began to feel a strong emotional reaction of revulsion when they saw it. That shared reaction gradually reshaped the community's moral standards. So, just because Bob isn't morally responsible, a community can still deem his actions wrong, hold him causally responsible, and restrict his freedom if he poses a danger.
Moral scrutiny no longer exists. Moral disagreement is meaningless.
Moral scrutiny can still exist, it just won't look the same way as in a worldview that assumes free will. In my view, moral feelings are innate, but also shaped by a person's environment, culture, and the information they have access to. For example, if someone genuinely believes that homosexuals are trying to lead people to hell, then from their perspective, it might feel morally justified to take actions against them. But that's not necessarily a difference in moral instinct, it's a difference in factual understanding. A lot of moral disagreements come down to disagreements about the facts. If you can challenge the underlying belief, like showing that there's no good reason to think gay people are leading anyone to hell, and you do it effectively, then that person's feelings about the issue may shift. So, in that sense, moral scrutiny is still possible. It just means we examine not only someone's moral reactions, but also the beliefs and information that those reactions are built on.
There is no meaningful difference between a lion being an amoral agent and a human being a moral agent. They are both being jerked around by their nature.
He's mostly right, but the key difference is that one has evolved the capacity to share those gut-level emotional reactions, the ones that bind individuals into a moral community and gives them the ability to shape its values from within.
The entire justice system should be eradicated. It is irrational to punish someone if you don't think they should be punishable. i.e., culpable for their actions.
In my view, punishing someone just for the sake of punishment is not justified. But that doesn't mean we should just, get rid of the criminal justice system entirely. You can still hold people causally responsible for their actions. Also, we still need to evaluate behavior, assign causal responsibility, and protect the community. We might replace punishment with rehabilitation, deterrence, or containment, but not with nothing. So it's not about abandoning accountability, it's about shifting the purpose from blame and retribution to prevention and protection.
Your view collapses into practical amorality because the key component of morality has been stripped out. Traditionally, morality is the subsector of agathology that deals with the behavior of beings capable of behavioral scrutiny.
My view doesn't collapse morality into amorality. We can still use morality as the standard by which we evaluate people's actions, just without relying on blame or retribution. Even if someone can't be held morally responsible in the traditional sense, morality still helps us identify when something is wrong, and even if that person was causally determined to do the wrong thing, the moral community can still recognize the harm and respond not by punishing for punishment's sake, but by focusing on rehabilitation and prevention. When someone does something wrong, we can just say, hey, that thing was wrong. How can we make sure that this doesn't happen again?
So the free will theory states that your choices and actions out of your own will are independent of prior events or external constraints. However, the moment you are born, there's already automatic, harsh, and very clear external constraints.
The external constraints he's talking about is the law. And to me, the law is just really another part of someone's environment. So yes, I'd agree that laws can influence or even determine certain behaviors, but that's because the law is part of the environment doing the determining. At the start of this video, you heard me say that research shows solitary confinement doesn't really work. So you might be wondering, how do I know that? Well, I usually approach research in three main ways. For more philosophical topics like transcendental freedom, I use a mix of Google and ChatGPT to get a better grasp on the concepts. Sometimes I'll just Google the name of the concept and read articles or academic papers. And other times, I'll ask ChatGPT to point me towards books or papers that dive deeper into the topic. For more scientific or evidence-based subjects like solitary confinement, I mainly rely on three websites. First is LibMap. It's a great tool where you can just enter a few keywords and it'll show you a network of relevant academic papers. It's really helpful for finding research quickly. Then for papers that are behind a paywall, I either use Sci-Hub to access them for free, or if that doesn't work, I'll just email one of the authors directly. Most researchers are surprisingly open to sharing their work if you just ask nicely. And finally, there's Consensus. It's a website that uses AI to give you an overview of what the research says about a specific question. So if I type in, is solitary confinement good or bad? It shows me a consensus meter based on the top 14 most relevant studies. It also links directly to those papers so I can dig deeper and read them myself. And a free version is more than enough if you only need a handful of well-researched answers each month. If you want to try it out, the link will be in the description down below. So that's my basic research process. Now back to the video.
Free will, as such, may have some theological and rational gaps. Assuming that God has the qualities of a supreme entity, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, many may come to the logical conclusion that free will is false, something that was supported during the Protestant Reformation, more specifically by the position of John Calvin.
This isn't really an argument for free will, it's actually pushing back against the common claim that free will is something given to us by God. And here's the usual response to that argument.
If God is all-powerful, I'm sure he could overcome what we cannot understand.
Free will is a logical contradiction if you also believe in an all-knowing God. If God knows every action and decision you'll ever make, then those choices aren't really free. But if he doesn't know them, then he's not all-knowing. The only way around this is to say that God can somehow make logical contradictions work. But that's usually the same reason given for why God can't stop evil, because he can't violate logic. So if you're religious and believe in both an all-knowing God and free will, you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
I find this train of thought interesting. Under this idea, people have no real choice but believe they have free will, but yet you speak like as if you can actually convince them that they most likely don't?
Take this example. If someone says James has no choice but to drink a cup of coffee every morning, well, even if James doesn't have total freedom in what liquid he chooses to drink every day, you can't know that he has no choice but to do a certain action. Something could happen, a health scare, a lifestyle change, and suddenly he stops drinking coffee altogether. Sure, maybe that shift was determined from the start, but you couldn't have predicted it. So, saying that people have no real choice but to believe they have free will is a true statement for the past, but is just a guess in the future. Maybe you will react to the information in this video and it'll change your mind, or maybe not, who knows. Ultimately, people can and do change their beliefs about free will or other things when exposed to new ideas or experiences. Sure, those shifts again are still determined, but the point is the future isn't visible to us, so we can't go around declaring what others must believe or have no choice but to believe.
But if they can't actually choose, then this would be impossible, as they would be unable to do so. As they would have to choose to side with you, but that implies real choice. Otherwise, convincing would really be forced agreement.
Humans are not like closed programs. We react to our environment, we adapt, and we change. We might not have free will in the ultimate sense, but we can still make choices. Other mammals make choices too, and they're not free either, but they still change their behavior based on what's happening around them. Not only that, but compared to other animals, we humans are masters of adaptation that can process new information way more effectively. We also each have different strengths, and those strengths can often help others navigate their own weaknesses. A team of scientists, for example, can develop an anti-epilepsy medication that compensate for the nature of someone with epilepsy. And we now even have drugs that can directly repair faulty genes. As for persuasion, here's a simple case of persuasion without needing free will.
This soup needs sugar.
I don't think so. The recipe doesn't include it.
Try pouring a small bowl and adding some sugar. You'll see it tastes better.
You're right. That does taste better.
People already struggle with taking responsibility now for their actions. Telling them they had no real choice, I can't imagine will do anything but encourage bad behavior even further. There's a major difference with diseases and disorders, because diseases can be treated or cured, and people with disorders can be taken care of. But telling society at large this might just be the last push they needed.
Again, there is a difference between causal responsibility and moral responsibility. We hold dogs responsible for their actions insofar as they respond to consequences. It wouldn't make sense to reward or punish a dog for actions from a month ago because they won't connect the consequences to the behavior. Also, I would argue that removing moral responsibility would make for a better society. It would help us remove the blinders of blame and actually make us try to find the root causes of bad behavior. Instead of punishing, we could instead try to prevent and rehabilitate. I have a video talking about this. I'll link in the description down below if you want to see it.
There's a reason when a dog damages property, we don't send them to court or try to sue them for the damages. We punish, because their limited cognition understands when I do X, owner does Y. I don't like Y, so I don't do X. We hold humans truly responsible because a human knows that shouldn't chase after the mailman or bite and tear up couch cushions or straight just stand in your living room and piss on the rug. We punish dogs the way we do because they can't understand the higher level reason for why they shouldn't do these actions, which is why we discourage them from such behaviors in other ways.
Right, dogs can't understand the complexities of human society, so we don't hold them responsible the same way we would a typical adult. And even with people, it depends. Someone with a severe cognitive disability isn't held to the same standards as someone with a typical mental functioning. The way we hold people responsible all comes down to how well the being or the agent can respond to consequences and new information. There are different ways of holding someone responsible. You might explain what they did wrong and why, or use tools like positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, or even forms of punishment. But the key difference here is that none of these are about retribution. They're not about punishing someone just to balance the scales or something like that, or to make them suffer. They're about helping someone change, learn, or improve. It's about correction and not payback.
So to be clear, you want to tell people, 1, you can't make free choices because you have no free will, you only think you do. 2, there is no moral responsibility that you have, and as a result of this, society would actually improve after the message is ingrained. Really? Do you not see any other potential way this could swing? This could be the perfect setup for either mass suicide, increase or uptick in violent crime as aggression rises.
I think this guy watched way too many movies. Moral behavior isn't about whether someone believes in free will or not. People who have seriously thought through their religious beliefs and people who have seriously thought through free will skepticism tend to behave pretty similarly when it comes to morals. In the book Determined, the author talks about how the differences you sometimes see in moral behavior usually come from people who are uncertain or are still figuring out what they believe in. And it's that middle group that often gets overstated in studies trying to link belief in free will to moral behavior.
I agree, we shouldn't senselessly punish, but this idea of rehabilitation makes no sense if the person you're talking about has no free will. In your earlier example, you made the point that dog behavior can be changed, but they have no free will. But that's only possible because of punishments and reward, as explained earlier. They can't actually understand higher reasons why, but you seem to be against the idea of punishment, which makes me ask question, what do you think should happen when someone knowingly breaks the rule?
Rehabilitation would involve a mix of the approaches mentioned earlier: positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment, explaining why behavior is wrong, and other methods. The right method or combination of methods will depend on the individual cases. So, for example, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, uses a mix of some of the methods I just mentioned. It focuses on addressing the distorted thinking that leads to criminal behavior. And you don't need free will for CBT to work.
Because under determinism, persuasion becomes murky. You didn't persuade any individual to agree with you, as they were always going to or not. Let me give an example to highlight what I mean. You show a young child that when you line up dominoes and knock one over, and they all fall down, one by one, the child looks in wonder and then says to that, the last domino falling is random. You look in confusion and explain to the child there's nothing random about it falling because each one knocks over another in a sequence, meaning the last one falling is no more random than any other previous domino. The point of this story is to highlight that if determinism is correct, a person being persuaded by you or not is just like the last domino. They were always going to either agree with you or not. It may look like how they reacted was them changing, but that's like the young child saying the last one falling is random while ignoring the long series of dominoes leading up to the last one.
This is just like in the first post with the guy saying that deliberation was not possible without free will. In this conversation, I'm trying to persuade him that changing someone's mind is possible even in a deterministic universe. Sure, whether or not I succeed is determined, but the thing is, none of us know the outcome ahead of time. If he does change his mind, you could say, I was the second last domino to fall. But from where I'm standing, from where our perspective, it's like with each domino that falls, a new one suddenly appears in front of it. Think about a tornado that destroys a house. Do we say that the destruction of the house was caused by a billion-year-long chain of events going back to the Big Bang? Or do we just say the tornado destroyed the house? We usually say the tornado destroyed the house. Same thing goes for persuasion. If I convince someone, was it because I was born, or because the earth formed, or was it because of the arguments I gave? Even in a deterministic world, persuasion still matters. In a parallel universe where I didn't make these arguments, the person wouldn't have changed their mind.
There are certain groups more likely to commit crimes. What becomes the solution that doesn't involve targeting that whole group in particular? As you've mentioned those with mental disorders as an example of people who can't help their situation, and I agree that there's some causes that the underlying reason isn't really fixable. So what is supposed to be done if entire groups fall into this category as high-risk lawbreakers, but that isn't fixable? Historically speaking, trying to target the entire group is something that leads to good outcomes, even when it's done in the name of maximizing what's best.
If some groups are more likely to commit crimes, the answer isn't to target the group with broad punishments. It's to figure out why. If the cause is lead in the water, you fix that. If it's poor nutrition, underfunded schools, or lack of opportunity, you fix those as well. You don't punish the group, you solve the underlying root causes. That example I gave earlier, the baby boy treated with gene editing, was to show that even problems that seem impossible to fix can eventually be addressed. And you don't always have to completely cure someone either. Take ADHD. We don't cure ADHD. We use tools like medication, therapy, and organization strategies to help people with this condition function well in society. And that's good enough for now. But this guy seems to believe that some groups are just unfixable. And I have to ask, how do we know that? We've seen real rehabilitative therapies work. And in extreme cases where someone genuinely can't be rehabilitated, like a violent, murderous psychopath, we can isolate them from society for an indefinite amount of time, just like we would someone with a deadly contagious illness. That's not about blame, it's about protection of the community and ongoing care. Historically, he's right. Targeting entire groups has led to terrible outcomes, but that's because the assumption behind those policies were wrong. In Canada, for example, where I live, treating Indigenous people like children was disastrous, but that's because the idea that they were inferior was false. But we don't have to repeat that. We can use evidence-based policies to support struggling communities, and we can treat individuals as individuals, helping them when we can, protecting society when we must, but without lumping people into boxes and just judging them as a group.
Yes, you're correct, in the sense that one can never be 100% sure that James will drink coffee. The same way you can never be 100% sure it will rain in 3 days from now, as things could change. But if you check the news and it says 87% chance, you bring an umbrella. Not because you know 100%, but because the likelihood's so high it'd be stupid not to. And in the age that we are currently living in, the idea that it's simply incomprehensible to think that we could predict a future event with high confidence is simply no longer the case, and is becoming increasingly more accurate as time goes on. Which, this is where the issue lies. Because if we can predict that someone like James has an 80% chance of believing a certain belief, then we can know with high confidence that this is what he will believe. The same way, if there's an 80% chance of rain, you bring an umbrella.
Yes, that's true. We can make educated guess about what people believe or how they'll behave in the future. But humans respond to new information, and that makes us really hard to predict. If James has an 80% chance of drinking coffee today, but I offer him $10,000 to drink tea instead, well, you know what? James is probably drinking tea today. And just like the weather, the further out you try to predict human behavior, the harder it gets. You might have a pretty good idea that James will have coffee tomorrow, maybe even next week, but a year from now, that's a lot harder to predict. Human minds are chaotic systems. Tiny changes in input can lead to completely different outcomes in the future.
No, at the smallest scales, things stop being deterministic and start being probabilistic. And that kind of throws Newtonian determinism out the window. It's what Einstein was famously so wrong about.
That is true, but as far as I know, it doesn't really change much in any meaningful way at the macro level. I usually just argue as if determinism is approximately true on that scale, because bringing up quantum randomness doesn't really add anything useful to the conversation. It just ends up being an unnecessary disclaimer.
Does, however, we make choices that limit that will?
Not really. At the end of the day, the kind of freedom you'd need for moral responsibility just isn't something we actually have, no matter how you go about making your choices.
Neuroprediction would prove free will wrong. There's no logical reason to believe it's impossible. You could say it's so much data needed that it'd take decades or centuries to be able to do it, but you're going to need to explain the impossibility of it.
Most, if not all, chaotic systems like the weather seems to have a limit to how far into the future we can predict them. Quote, as demonstrated by Lighthill, the notion of a finite predictability limit for chaotic system is widely accepted, unquote. Because of their sensitivity to initial conditions, even the tiniest difference can lead to huge changes down the line. So to predict them perfectly, you'd need tools with infinite precision, which is just not humanly possible. And humans are chaotic systems too, and I see no reason to believe we're just an exception to the rule. So I think it's fair to say that perfect prediction of human behavior is impossible in practice. Here's a quote from the paper Free Will is Not a Testable Hypothesis. Quote, in Roski's word, the picture that neuroscience has yielded so far is one of mechanisms infused with indeterministic or stochastic processes. Whether or not a neuron will fire, what pattern of action potentials it generates, or how many synaptic vesicles are released have all been characterized as stochastic phenomena in our current best models. The timing of electrical spikes emitted by cortical neurons, for instance, has long been apparently stochastic. Unquote. So if you prefer, I can say that free will is practically unfalsifiable rather than definitely unfalsifiable, since I can't prove it with absolute certainty. But for this conversation, I don't think that distinction really changes anything.
This idea of chaotic systems isn't exactly accurate. The real issue is the amount of data we have to make predictions and how much space we have to store it. Every system has patterns, and every bit of chaos has a root cause. If you can locate the root cause, you can predict when or where the chaos will be. There's nothing unpredictable.
A difference as small as 0.00 followed with an infinite amount of zeros, 1, can grow into a massive divergence over time. So even if, in theory, there is a precise root cause behind an outcome, it's not something we could ever actually measure or detect. In the GIF you're seeing now, no amount of technology could perfectly recreate the notion of a double pendulum if you started it at an angle like 30 degrees plus pi degrees. That's because pi is an irrational number. You can never fully calculate it with exact precision. And with chaotic systems like this, even the tiniest variation, again, in the starting point eventually leads to a completely different outcome. So these were all the arguments that I responded to. If there are more, I might make a part 2 in the future. Also, if you disagree with anything that I said, do not hesitate to let me know in the comments down below, or you can join my Discord and we can talk about it.